I was just going to say, I think what seems to come down to is about who controls the production, who controls the distribution. And I think one of the things that it's very easy to forget when we're saying, oh, can we be supermarkets, can we not be supermarkets, is actually the incredible imagination of ordinary people once they have that release of you know, that kind of that explosion of imagination and genius really that comes with any real change in society. And I don't think we need to worry too much about it, because in a way I think it's great to speculate, but I think people will actually decide, yeah, okay, maybe we'll take the model of the co-op, maybe we won't, maybe we'll do something completely different, maybe someone will come up with some amazing idea none of us will ever think of. But that's what's going to happen. You know, it could also be quite a variety of those things. There might be some places, not in others, depending on what the local needs are. But the point is, it will be not about producing and controlling food purely for profit, but it'll be about us controlling and distributing it for our health, our needs, our sustenance, and our enjoyment, frankly.
I think there's a sort of a kind of utopian tension, because there's a sort of very good Marxist critique of utopia, and there's this kind of very English thing, which is getting odd, where I don't think we've been doing this today, but where people very dogmatically try and construct how everything's going to be in the future. And it was one of the things with Occupy was lovely, that somebody was saying, well, how would you sort out the world's food system? How would you do this? How would the commons work? I'm saying, well, look, you've got a basic issue of democracy, that 1% or 0.01% run everything, and you've got this secretive corporation of London, and the fact that you're fighting that and challenging that, that's the really, really key thing. Likewise with Occupy, I'm not going to say this isn't exactly what I want from somebody. It's actually uncovering the power structures. However, when you're in a society, it's difficult to get beyond that society. So maybe, to some extent, we still do need to question all these things to get beyond it. I was also going to say about the idea of peasants and modernity and so on. It's certainly, a lot of my politics, being in contact with people like Blanco, has been via indigenous. And I think Marxists, we have to take indigenous very, very seriously. I've just got hold of Marx's ethnographic notebooks. And what's interesting is, in the 3 years before he died, instead of finishing Das Kapital, he made notes on indigenous. And I think this proves that Marx was a communist. I think this is a remarkable thing, that he was interested in the indigenous because they had communism. And I think the Marxist project has said, you had primitive communism. How after capitalism can the working class create communism and have that richness of kind of economical property rights within industrialised society? And to me, that's the kind of project. But what's very interesting is a lot of parts of the world, indigenous have got lots of political agency and lots of power to do things. And certainly if you look at Iroquois around New York, they're also people who are working class. And that's very, very interesting. And when I come across indigenous people, like I was looking at a guy who was indigenous in Alaska, who had a blog on food sovereignty and was very realistic about capitalism and so on, and I had some dialogue. And he was saying, as Hugo Blanco says, that indigenous people want to have their land rights, but they probably want to have mobile phones as well. And how fucking fantastic is that? Because normally we have like a romanticisation of people in the past, and we're back to the past, or we have this sort of unilinear notion of progress. But what's interesting is where you get people saying, well, we actually have evolved this system, traditionally this is quite good, but maybe our society's been really sexist and we want to drop that. And we would actually like to have Facebook. And that, to me, is where it gets interesting, is people, trying to think outside tramlines of history, that we're all trying to get somewhere or go back somewhere, and actually doing it differently. So I think it's a digression.
Well, actually, I was reading a paper by this bloke Andrew Gamble, who's some sort of professor at Oxford, and basically there was this paper on economic governance. And what he was doing was to look at societies, and the point was that he said, look, we are Anglo-Saxons and we have the tradition of the first capitalist nation, and we had the market, the free market. And this has worked for us, it's been very good in terms of our employment and so forth, and that's become part of our psyche. And that's also been passed on to the Americans. And he says that there are other models. And what he was looking at, what he did was to look at Germany, who had to catch up, and they had to deliberately stimulate growth via institutions. And so they did not rely on the market, they had all sorts of intermediate institutions that got them where they wanted to be. And it has in fact been quite successful in terms of German capitalism catching up. And another point that he makes is about systems of economic governance in the 20th century, and he contrasts the Soviet model with the free market model. And basically, you've got hierarchies which include planning, i.e. the Soviet command Soviet model, as opposed to the diversification of things like capitalism. He says, what seems to have happened in practice is that capitalism, through the market, has been much more efficient at allocating resources. So you're actually delegating things. So basically you've got, we can see, I mean, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that you had the problems of Soviet technology in terms of petrochemicals and electronics and things like that, which have been quite unsuccessful compared to the West, which has actually diversified a lot more. I mean, Silicon Valley. And I mean, this is very sort of not involved, but ultimately, what you may need to do is to have networks. And the way of making change is to have networks and to try and stimulate things. Like, I mean, I think the concept of actually socialising Tesco's, that's really quite difficult, isn't it? So, I mean, what you're looking at really is Tesco's as a network with all sorts of, local people who are running things and ultimately all communicating and the system works. But, I mean, essentially, Tesco's is a hierarchy, isn't it? As most capitalist institutions are. So, I mean, maybe this is a way of thinking of it. So what you're looking at ultimately is some form of mixed economy, and the problem is really how to initiate those, how to get the whole thing moving so it catches on in society. I hope that's not too confusing.
I would say maybe with the mixed economies, you've got the state, which is problematic, and you've got the market, which is problematic. So when you mix them up, maybe you remain with something which is very problematic.
Oh yeah, well that was the whole point of this paper actually. He's talking about, how effective is the state in terms of promoting growth and full employment and so on and so forth. And there's this sort of interaction between the state and the free market. And the boundaries shift depending on circumstances. And also depending on the cultural heritage of the state where these things are going on.
One of the things that you raise is food localism, in a sense, and that seems to me to be both very important and something that's quite problematic. The hungry nuts, try and have some sort of agricultural autarky in this country. We stuck on turnips or whatever else. In February, I mean, God knows February is bad enough.
Of course, that's good.
But I mean, there is this. There is an interesting thing. That's where the thing about networks come in, I suppose, because. There's all sorts. There's all sorts of fruit around today that I can't remember seeing until I was in my, I suppose, 20s. So things like just take banana production in the Caribbean. Clearly, a situation where many of the Caribbean islands are absolutely dependent on something that they're continually screwed over, the answer seems to be not that we shouldn't have bananas, but that we have a relationship, that we have a fair relationship.
The initials Alba pop into my head, so you mentioned that really. And I also said to think, oh, maybe that's vegetarian to eat rabbits, and the royals might as well give up their royal estate to get the rabbits. And I think protein for people is probably tricky, but maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'll be shot down.
Well, this may be a romantic notion. It does relate to, I think, the Conrad's point. I was struck by an article I read a few years ago online in this journal, Turbulence, which some of you may have come across. It was trying to make the point for a sustainable future, then everything possible we could do locally would be done locally, and those local communities, you devolve power to that local community to make those decisions on those items. But it would recognise you would also need a regional economy, to say like grapes grow in France or wherever, they don't grow in Sweden or whatever. So you will have to have trans-regional interactions, and therefore you would need like a regional layer of government or control. So you'd have like base level local communities that would recycle, be self-sufficient, build their own, make their own buildings, run their own schools. So as much as possible be local, but then you would have to have these inter-regional networks, and therefore you would have different levels of authority on that basis. Now, right, you may say this is a rather romantic dream, but I found it quite appealing as a sort of way of thinking about things like that.
Just to interject one note of cynicism or thought, whatever. I remember a debate. This is some European, I think it was like a social forum, and it was some European Green Party event, and there was Colin Hines, who's the great Archduke of localisation, and then Nick Hilliard from the Corner House. The Corner House produced really, really good analysis of like the city and commons and stuff, and maybe something about them, but very, very good. And his put down to Colin Hines, I think a much more extreme version of this than you, was that Colin Hines shouldn't confuse geography with politics, which I thought was good. And I think with the food, the localisation is important. And it's also very feel-good because people like it, but it's the politics as well, so we can control structures, do you know? Which is we're not in the power to actually design this. But maybe the guerrilla gardening.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading a couple of days ago that I can't remember how this was established, but the average American carrot travels 1,800 miles from being dug up from farmer to plate. Which is quite extraordinary.
I've had some carrots that have gone up at 15 foot.
But then, I found myself the other day eating Greek yogurt, which is actually made by a German company, where milk had been transported to Greece.
You can't get expelled from the Green Party if you do that anymore. You're all right.
But I mean, there are all sorts of absurdities within having such a centralised system as we have.
The Caroline Lucas, my William book, is quite good at all that.
Isn't it the case with apples? I'm sure I heard this farm today. I mean, a lot of the apples, whether they're the ones used for eating or whether they're used for cider, are now coming from abroad, whilst a lot of the orchards that did exist in Kent or Somerset have actually been dug up.
Yes.
Which I mean, is crazy. But I mean, they were tastier as well. The other thing, sticking up fruit, I know it's slight tangent, but on the banana thing, I did go for a phase, I'm probably not quite as good at looking at what's on the label at the moment as I've been at some stages, but of going for the fair trade things for the Windward Islands because of the fact that You know, the United Fruit Company, alias Chiquita, or whatever phony Latino name it adopted, was sort of seeking to monopolise the bananas.
Hasn't that been the most successful of fair trade campaigns? Because a couple of the supermarkets now only take fair traded food and bananas.
Yeah, it has a real problem in that it reduces the genetic stock of the banana. So, I mean, when I was teaching out in Grenada, 1980, you would go to the market and you would get a whole range of bananas, different sorts. Come over here and it's just one type of banana. That, that domination by United Fruit or whatever it is leads to that inevitably.
The trouble is, I mean, that banana is actually chosen because it travels well.
Absolutely, not because it's
so
it
it has certain qualities which I make it particularly suitable for shipping by multinational companies. So this actually points out really what we're up against. In fact, we've got these multinationals who are in many cases more powerful than nation states, and they are in such a position of power they can actually hold a Dutch auction with national states that corporation tax must not be too high, otherwise they'll transfer their business elsewhere. And we've really got to combat this. So as part of the whole deal is that the more you force taxes down, the more your welfare state and so forth suffers. So the problem is how we generate grassroots resistance to this with this localism agenda.
With the thing about single varieties of bananas, there's a bigger problem than the economic and political structures in it. If you have a single variety of bananas, then there's much less disease resistance, and they're wiped out much quicker and much easier. It's the same with hops in this country. There's a big problem with mildew-resistant hops. They're, a while ago, I'm a brewer, so I'm interested in hops. But there was a whole raft of low English hops that got wiped out because of mildew. So they bred, I think it's at Y, they bred a whole bunch of mildew-resistant hops, and those are the main hops that you get nowadays. But actually, the majority of hop varieties that are used in kind of the big fizz kind of beers are all German noble hops, which come from basically one or two different varieties, and they're incredibly not disease resistant. They're quite useful to grow because of that, because of the kind of the monocultural kind of thing aspect to it. Where there's that diversity, you get a diversity of stuff growing, and therefore a diversity of things, and you pull out, and it's kind of halting evolution to a certain extent, having those single varieties. It says, we're going to stop this, we want this one, but then where the crops would evolve around a disease, not in their normal way of working, they're stopped from evolving around a disease, and kind of we go, what are we going to do? We're going to sort of collapse the market, so we can't have a collapse of the market, so we end up spraying something on it.
And where this becomes even more dangerous is I was reading last week about a variety of yew tree that has become almost extinct and is the only known source of a cancer drug.
Well, it's not the only known source.
Or the main source. But the problem is that with this monoculture driving out other species, we don't know, but they could very well be sources of some sort of drugs that so many of the drugs that have been discovered are unknown aspects of known plants and things, and if we drive them out,
but you also get the other problem of when you look at the crops that are grown, it's all F1 hybrids, which are restrictive in themselves, and you lose a lot of genetic variation by growing those. And a lot of, if you go through, you can see catalogues for allotments, you get an enormous number of F1 hybrids from there, which you would have thought would be the one place where you get local varieties or something.
There's one just tiny glimmer of hope. It's spark of light at the moment. I don't know if anybody saw that Waitrose announced that they were going to start selling ordinary apples. Not ones with funny shapes and little models or things like that, for a bread cheap. And on the basis that they taste, they're just as good. And I mean, this is clearly part of their response to the, to the financial crisis. But I mean, who knows? It could be
although that is distorted if you go to Tesco, Cambridgeshire, the big cauliflower growing area of Lincolnshire, and they've now labelled all their cauliflowers Lincolnshire grown, and yet they're all identical size and shape.
Yeah, so perhaps we should be going into work that's demanding. I want to see
I want to know.
yeah, on the curly one.
Yes. Just to subvert it.
Well, various aspects of this industrialised system anyway are unsustainable. Like US pigs, most of their pork, I understand, is all from North Carolina, and you have polluted watercourses. Similarly, and they mentioned the shrimp example in, I think, Southeast Asia. But then you've got like bird flu that's spread because like massive looking after of fowl in one area. So we have put ourselves at danger by this industrialised system, by monoculture. I think the same's happening in Brazil, isn't it? You know, these vast monoculture fields of soya that take over from the rainforest. So it's actually a system that kills the planet if you look at it over more than a narrow time value.
And that's obviously human consumption.
Yes, indeed.
When you look at the fish farms, what they feed the fish is ground up anchovies, and where they come. No. You can't blame Tesco for everything.
Yeah. Do you want to? I think we probably need to start wrapping it up. So
I was going to wrap up very quickly, just because I just came here to do a workshop, but I think at 4 o'clock I'm speaking in the plenary, and I want to actually eat some more about food and things like that. Well, I don't think since it needs summing up really, and I think we've come up with a diversity of points that kind of integrate quite well that capitalist agriculture is killing the planet, oppressing people, and there's obviously a debate about how local we have the food. But it's about the politics and being in control of it. But maybe though we haven't quite got the eco-socialist revolution in Britain yet, we can press some apples and do some guerrilla gardening, and get involved with some campaigns. And one thing I was just going to bring in is I was asked to go and talk about eco-socialism by Unite in Ireland. So I went to Belfast and did this, which was great to do. And this was organised by a guy who's involved with Unite, who came from Cambridgeshire, and talked about the fact that his family came from a tradition of workers who worked on the land. And the event I did was the Jimmy Brown lecture, and it's from a guy who was a trade union rural activist in Fermanagh. So there's also a history of working class trade union action on the land. I mentioned the top bubble martyrs, so we need to keep, I think with the ecology and socialism, we've always got to keep integrating ecology and socialism. But above all, we've got to fight for it.
You see Chivers, which is the big fruit garden in Cambridgeshire, set up